Okay, good afternoon everyone and welcome to this special webinar brought to you jointly by BSI and the High Volume Manufacturing Catapult. I'm Ben Sheridan, the Digital Manufacturing Lead at BSI. We are discussing the recent Ventilator Challenge and what we can learn in terms of cross-sector collaboration and innovation and what we need to do to embed this learning to make our manufacturing supply chains more resilient. The need for more resilient supply chains has long been recognised as an important goal for a number of reasons, but the pandemic has thrown the spotlight on this and shown just how precarious the situation can be. The Ventilator Challenge here in the UK has shown how possible it is to rapidly create very precise, highly regulated products by utilising manufacturing capacity and collaborating across different sectors. I'm delighted to be joined by Dick Elsey, CEO of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, his CTO Sam Turner, and also by Rab Scott, Head of Digital at the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, which is also part of the Catapult. Dick, Sam and Rab will present to you their perspectives on this and then we'll have a discussion. I've got loads of your questions and we'll try and get through as many as possible. Please feel free to keep sending them in throughout the webinar as well. So let's get straight into it. Dick, can you introduce yourself and give an overview of how the Ventilator Challenge was able to mobilise so successfully? Thanks, Dick.
Thanks, Ben, and good afternoon, everybody. Dick Elsey. I run the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, which, as a British engineer, I'm proud to say is now the largest advanced manufacturing research institute in Europe. Those of us who don't know what we do, we help companies scale up new and innovative technology. So we take the risk out of that critical phase where you've got an emerging concept and it's the whole challenge of scaling it up and the risks that go with that. And we principally help you with that through the access to world-class kit and equipment and skills. That's how we operate. 800+ million quid's worth of assets, 7 centres, 18 sites. It's a big thing in the UK. Anyway, a big part of our job is bringing companies together in collaboration. And over the last 9 years of our operation, that's really been a kind of watchword for the success of the Catapult, is bringing companies together in a neutral space, even direct competitors to work together on bringing new technology to market. And with that in mind, I was sitting at my desk watching this sort of unfolding crisis of COVID in early March. And there were early signs of the fact that we were going to run out of intensive care ventilators because there were all those awful pictures of people in Italy being turned away from hospital because there wasn't enough equipment. And so our government decided that it needed to first of all try to purchase more, which of course the market was swamped. It couldn't pick any up. They picked a few up, and realizing that, they then turned to industry to say, or ask industry whether it could repurpose itself to manufacture complex intensive care ventilators. And this is, asking non-medical device companies to do so. There was no shortage of offers at the time, and that sort of, there was the emerging sense of a problem. There was a general call to arms went out. Who's interested in helping? And there were thousands of offers of help that went into the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Lots of enthusiasm. And it all kicked off with a phone call from the Cabinet Office, from Michael Gove, who's the Chief Secretary of the Cabinet Office. He presented a rapidly manufactured ventilator system. So this was a specification, minimum requirements to meet the clinical need. So it was always a question of, could you go and make these? And there was 100+ companies on the phone. And right at the end, Michael Gove said, right, any questions from industry? And there was this incredible vacuum of silence where a well-intentioned request from government was met with well-intentioned offers of support from industry, but how on earth to close the gap between those two. So given that collaboration is a natural thing that the High Value Manufacturing Catapult does, I stuck my neck out and said, oh, Mr. Gove, I'll pull a few companies together and see what we can do. So principally from that point, I gathered together a bunch of industrialists, simple measure, people I knew and trusted, and as a core, and those who I knew were prepared to take a personal and a corporate risk to get involved. Because there's lots of people who were offers of help, but few actually were prepared to take the big personal gamble of putting their personal reputation and company on the line to support. Anyway, cut a long story short, we started the kernel core team of a consortium, and we looked at the challenge and decided that the quickest way to get product to market, bearing in mind they needed them like now, thousands now, was to get behind the production of an existing ventilator unit. And there's not many made in the UK. So one's made by Smiths Industries. It's called the Parapack, made out of Luton. And we initially got behind Smiths Industries to support them with scale up. They were making about 30 a week. And we looked at specification and basically put a bundle of support behind Smiths to help them scale that up. And while we would, more on that later from Sam, but while we were starting to form that, even in the first 2 or 3 days, it became quite clear to Cabinet Office that we were a pretty credible group of people who were rapidly getting their act together. And so from the phone call on the 16th, on the Friday of that week, we had a call from Cabinet Office. Could you take a look at another ventilator? And this was the Penlon ESO 2. And I'm going to tell you about the Penlon ESO 2 in a second as the kind of as a very focused story within the ventilator challenge. The Penlon's a small Abingdon-based manufacturer of anaesthesia equipment, and they don't make a ventilator per se, but in response to the government's challenge, they configured several bits of their existing kit into a device which more than met the clinical standard. And the clinicians and the medical regulator, the MHRA, said, if this could be made, this is the answer. This is what we really want. So we were asked to get behind that, and we sent a crack team into Penlon. It's a very small business making about two devices a day. And we took a look at this prototype device of these configured assemblies, and we had to make a decision within sort of 24 hours whether we were capable of getting it scaled up. And we made that decision and committed to it. And we formed a separate team around that device, while the Smiths guys, with the support of Rolls-Royce and GK and others, set off down to scale their device up as well. Next slide, please. So the team we wrapped around Penlon were, they see the consortium signatories. These are the core team. So I think for each one of these logos is a very senior person, and there were the top guys here. We had Graham Ford, who's the chairman of Ford of Britain, in there with his sleeves rolled up. We had Mark Howard, who's head of technology for Airbus. Mark Matheson, who's head of McLaren Technologies for racing. Ali Burns, the managing director of Siemens Healthineers. All interesting, all engineers, and all used to delivering complex programs, whether they be medical devices, high performance motorsport, planes or cars. One thing we all had in common was a fluency in complex program management. So it almost immediately formed a bond between us, and I think really helped with a huge and seemingly insurmountable challenge to have a degree of fluency. Although the three-letter acronyms between aerospace, automotive, and motorsport are different, the fundamental new product introduction processes are pretty much the same. And underneath, there's a whole long list of people. That's not a complete list. There were lots more than that, but there was a big wrap of people that came in and supported us, and on everything from logistics to ERP systems. And on the right's a picture of the device. So that's the Penlon ESO 2. And bearing in mind, on the 16th of March, none of us even knew what a ventilator looked like. That image has become emblazoned on our minds. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's not a car or an aircraft, but it's not that simple. So as I said, it's based on an existing design. And this is really just to frame the size of it and the complexity of the supply chains and lots of things, because that's what's relevant to a broader discussion on supply chains and cross-sector collaboration. 700 parts in each one. There was 365 unique items bought out from 88 suppliers. During the program, we changed the BOM significantly, about 450 changes. BOM cost about $3.5 grand, and I'm delighted that these were delivered to the NHS for less than 10 grand each, with all of the everything, all at cost, all investment amortized, and less than budget, which was really quite encouraging. Because the Penlon device used to only making 2 a day, and we had to scale up to 400 a day, we had to put in a whole load of parallel supply chains. So there was a number of items with multiple suppliers. It is a complex medical device, and of course has to meet very tight regulatory standards. So we had some very rapid learning to do about ISO 13485, more about that later. And unlike some things in motorsport and aerospace, every system or completed ventilator had to have a very complex device history record to go with it. Next slide, please. So just to give a sense of the scale of it, I said 450 engineering changes over the course of the program. Mind you, this is measured in a few weeks, it's just not years. We had 301 deviations away from the specification. Those had to be resolved very quickly. So there was a maximum, well, we had an average of 3.5 days per deviation approval time. And when we were really in the high volume pace where, seconds counted, we were always turning these around with full authority within 24 hours. In terms of problem management, well over 1,000 issues, and more than half of those were contained within 48 hours. And I'll explain a little bit more how we kind of broke the normal product development introduction rules and how we had to throw a lot of resource at problem containment and management. It wasn't without a lot of engineering work either. So there's well over 9,000 person hours of engineering problem resolution. Everything from sorting out complex process capability problems, bearing in mind 2 units a day didn't reflect high levels of process capability, so we had to introduce a lot of that, a lot of engineering tweaks into the process to get capability. Half the BOM, as I described, ended up being reviewed. Next slide, please. And here's just a sort of cartoon of the scale of the challenge. So we started in early March with a handshake with the Cabinet Office, who was our principal customer, and started procuring parts like mad from both existing supply chains and, of course, setting those parallel supply chains up as well. So in the first 4 weeks, we'd secured over 11 million components from 88 suppliers in 10 countries. And where we needed to put parallel supply chains or struggled to get parts that could be made in the UK, we set an awful lot of UK-based production up. And McLaren in particular, with their Formula One factory down in Woking, really kicked in. So lots of complex valves, manifolds, all that sort of thing. So throwing a lot of their machinery at that, as well as many of the other Formula One teams, which of course, if you will remember, they weren't racing in March and April, so we had access to some terrific advanced engineering and manufacturing capability. We got DHL linked in very early on in terms of managing the sheer quantity of components. Imagine there's a sort of list of things, statistics of the amount of components and the amount of traveling time that was involved in handling all of that. Because this is a medical device, we needed to have the approval of the regulator, So we worked extremely closely with the regulator, bearing in mind we were under sort of emergency conditions. That's not an excuse to pass things off lightly, because people's lives are at stake with these sort of devices. But from the first prototype of the ISO2, we had sign-off in 21 days. So what approval time, which normally takes about 6 to 9 months, was squeezed into 3 weeks, which is quite extraordinary. All of the manufacturing facilities, which I'll come on to in a minute, needed to be signed off for 13485, because it's not just about the product, it's the manufacturing process. And a lot of the supply base needed auditing too. So we had 180 suppliers that we had to audit within 3 weeks. I'm pleased to say that during the trials of the device, because the medical regulation, it did include a clinical trial, there was a request for some improved functionality, which from the clinicians, which we managed to incorporate some engineering change and get back into the system within 24 hours. So we kind of up-spec the device in a relatively short space of time. So then really is how the thing was put together. We had three major assembly factories, production factories, if you like. Airbus in Broughton kicked off with the big sub-assembly, the absorber and the flow meter. And they set up 550 assembly workers on 5 shifts. We built the factory built all the factories using 3D digital models, so an absolute classic digital twin, checking that the factory and process system worked and was COVID friendly. And the factories were built in 4 weeks. So that's including the time to do the digital twin. So we got this factory set up. We have Ford, we're doing the ventilator sub-assembly, and they had 700 people on 190 workstations running multi-shifting to do that. And McLaren, as you would expect them to, because it's got wheels on it, they set up a production facility to make the trolley unit, making 250 trolleys a day out of the Woking facility. All that then came together in Surface Technologies International in Hook, STI, who basically did the sort of final assembly of the units, and then passed into Penlon in Abingdon, which we basically stripped all of their manufacturing facility out to become a final test buy-off with some additional support from GKN in Abingdon as well. So basically, end of final testing, there's about 10 hours of testing per unit. Imagine that was quite complex at 400 units a day, and then off to a storage facility in Donington, along with distribution to the NHS. So, quite a complex piece of industrialisation. In all, probably 2,500 people involved in this particular programme. Hugely complex and done in a very, very short space of time. Next slide, please. So how is it done so fast? Well, I suppose a bunch of experienced engineers running programs understood where to take the risk. And those of you on the webinar who are involved in normal new product introduction processes will be familiar with the top box here. Now, this is an incredible simplification of people's new product introduction processes with gateways and all those sort of things. But typically there's a series of plan, do, check, acts from prototype through pre-production. You keep doing that: build, test it, check it, resolve the problems, have another go, constantly improving the process capability till you start production with a high degree of confidence. Then you gradually ramp up as you find those process snags that weren't foreseen, chance to resolve those gently en route, even sometimes a chance to stop and regroup and crank up production again. Because we had such a short space of time with the ventilator challenge, we were actually doing the plan, do, check, act bit on the hoof all concurrently. And the only way we managed to do that was, to be honest, with a lot of really good quality engineering resource and the ability to get problems very, very quickly resolved. Only once did we actually decide to take time out in the production ramp, because the level of problem management did get quite significant. So we stopped for, I think, 2 or 3 days while we sorted out a backlog of things, and then restarted. So it was a case of having this concurrent plan, do, check, act problem resolution process running all the way through the volume ramp up. Next slide, please. Just to give a sense of the pace, so from the call to arms on the 16th of March, the first ISO 2 model was produced, bearing in mind that included getting the medical regulator on board. So we started producing them out of the new factory process, and then 12 weeks after that, we had over 11,000 of them. You can see this chart showing the rate of acceleration through the program. So you know, the first 900 took well, from the first 100 took 29 days. You know, the next 900 took 11 days, and towards the end, you know, we were producing well over 1,000 every 3 days. So it shows the incredible pace of acceleration of the production system. I can tell you, but towards the end, I mean, you know, if we'd kept on going, we were really motoring, because the process capability was getting better and better because of all the investment that we put in through those plan, do, check, acts. The process was enriching all the time and getting better and better and better. So it was it was quite a blow to finish, because the system was absolutely running itself at that point, which was a terrific thing to observe. Next slide, please. So just to try and capture the critical success factors of all of this in a few points. I think it really helped having a compelling purpose to a mission, a really clear objective. Because lives were at risk, we had no idea that the curve was going to flatten out. So every hour that went past on the project that, you know, we weren't making progress, it did actually feel in the project that, you know, there was potential lives lost. So it was extremely compelling from that point of view. And because we'd stepped up in the national interest, I mean, that was incredibly focusing. And the interesting thing, we were all in it together. There was no book that was written about this sort of thing. The only thing we really had to trade with was our experience and our engineering capability, and of course the great support that we had of the businesses behind us. Next, please. This is not an elitist comment, but we always chose the best quality people to do what was necessary. Rule 1 of the consortium, first ever meeting we had, not long after forming, was no ego. So everybody was to leave their personal and corporate egos outside of the project. So it ended up with a very flat meritocratic structure. Capability always trumped superiority. So there were no badges or stripes. It was a very, very empowering environment for people. It was very trusting. There was warmth in it, but there was also reasonable challenge. We held each other to account. And the really interesting thing is, although the central core team, the few of us were known to each other, some weren't. So Ali Burns from Siemens was new to all of us, and we formed a relationship with people that we'd never actually physically met before. So we were doing all of this on Teams calls. So it's really quite interesting that a chemistry can be built, even though you don't actually physically meet. And we never had any sort of icebreaker event as a team. Bearing in mind there were thousands of people involved. What was really interesting, though, is the culture of this empowerment and focus reached every corner of the enterprise without us actually having to consciously communicate it. So when I went to Broughton at Airbus to see the guys, to see how they're getting on, engineers wrestling with a line side problem, just talking to them, their entire culture was identical to the one that was set up right at the beginning in the consortium. So it had permeated through natural kind of diffusion, if you like, without us ever having to actively communicate. And there's a strong sense of doing the right thing and empowering people is a really almost visceral factor in all of this. Is really kind of all pervasive. Next, please. We democratized all of the data. So one thing, there was nothing hidden, and this is a really important message actually for onward learning. We made all of it accessible, shared drives and systems. Anybody wanted access to it, they could. And another powerful thing, we gave our customer, the Cabinet Office, full access to this data as well. And the quid pro quo was, if we gave full access and real-time information, there would be no need for heavy-handed governance or oversight. And although that took a while to win that hearts and minds over, once it was working, it was immensely powerful. So everybody was informed, everybody knew what was going on, and there was therefore no need for complex and heavy-handed oversight. Because often when you get oversight, you often have people overseeing you who are not close enough to the information, and it slows things down. So there's a really important aspect to the success of the program was this open access and no data being private. Next, please. Yeah, as I said, I think, you know, plan, do, check out. We were running process and product in parallel. We always aimed high, and if we failed, we wanted to fail fast and pick ourselves up again. And in terms of process, if there was something that didn't fit, we basically invented something on the spot. So we had quite a high amount of pop-up IT. Rather than take big and complex systems, you just literally got some people to help us do some rapid pop-up systems, which are an exact and immediate fit for the need. Next, please. An uncompromising removal of constraints. We knew that multiple constraints would kill the program, so we were utterly uncompromising in removing those constraints. We thought that we'd be stuck for parts initially, because that would be the killer. We never stopped for part shortages, even though we always thought we would, because we threw so much at making sure that we would never be constrained. And in a program of this complexity, starting from scratch, there you can imagine there were many constraints, and there's no magic formula here. It's just about lots of capable people with the right brief, lifting those constraints and lifting the whole system as a result. Next, please. Beyond a can-do culture, there's a will-do, a very, very high focus in the team on output and a low focus on input. Quite clearly, 9 to 5 wasn't going to work, so we were working long hours, and ultimately the program ran round the clock for 3 or 4 months in total. So there was always activity 24 hours a day, but it did engender a tremendous trust. Even though it was hard work, it was quite exhilarating working in that environment, and many of us have actually challenged ourselves to say, all bar the 18-hour days, why can't we work this way all the time? What stops us from releasing the capability in our organizations to act like this and do the right thing? It was quite inspirational to be involved in that, and that inspiration really drove us through many of the dark times when, you know, we had seemingly intractable problems and just had to dig down and put resource into it and work hard at them. That sort of will-do culture was, more often than not lifted us out of those deep troughs. Next, please. With Cabinet Office, we had a clear, transparent relationship, a single point of contact. We had very clear boundaries at the outset. So the relationship, the reporting, as I described, the open data, and the need for us to maintain our autonomous decision making was really critical, because we found the moment you then ask people for permission to do things, you immediately inject uncertainty, other people who perhaps might not be so well informed. So we were very careful to do that, and we had very well crafted communications, both intra-team between the team and also externally with the media. So we put a lot of effort into that. Next, please. Strong relationships. There's no doubt about it. We did leave some existing relationships, people we trusted, knew would take a risk, but those the infection of the will-do spirit was strong, and we formed new relationships very quickly around the challenge. And another thing, I think, important learning point is we never treated the suppliers in kind of like a traditional way, like beat the supplier up if they're not quick enough. We really took a leaf out of the motorsport book of there's no point in beating somebody up if they're going to let you down, is understand what the constraint is and how we can help. So the sort of things we did there, we helped critical suppliers. There were some very complex valves, for instance, coming out of Switzerland, and they were desperately supply constrained. So McLaren actually built them additional production tooling to help them overcome their bottlenecks. We just did it in order to relieve those bottlenecks. So we had a very intimate relationship with those suppliers to keep them on side of us, and we think that's a critical element actually in the fact that we never ran out of bits. So having said that, though, one of the key challenges that we felt we had in amongst all of this was a realization that we were very dependent on international supply chains, and when, of course, those were difficult, there was quite a strong realization that the UK is actually very vulnerable. So supply chain vulnerability was brought home really hard to us in the program. And the other thing as well is, because we had to step up lots of alternative suppliers, we had aerospace, automotive, motorsport, medical devices, all these industries together, the interoperability issues were quite challenging. Even though we spoke the same language as engineers, many of our systems were different. And I'm now going to draw stumps on this bit and hand over to Sam to tell you a little bit more about that.
Okay. Afternoon, everybody. I'm Sam Turner. I'm the CTO of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. At the start of the programme, I was supporting the other work stream, actually, the Smiths Power Pack scale up, just in the first few weeks of launch. If you go on to the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit of just about standards interoperability learnings we had. So, unlike the Penland device, the Smiths device was an existing device, being produced in sort of tens of per week, and we're scaling to hundreds per week. We did have at the start great work from the F1 teams, particularly working together to deconstruct the initial power pack devices, revisit the bill of materials, create new 3D master models, so that we could go to build supply chain assembly lines without disrupting the existing Smiths supply chain. So there was, a clear instruction not to confuse the existing supply chain and try and scale independently. So right from the outset, we were creating new master models, and we were looking at standing up assembly sites for some of the aero tier ones that we're working with, and rapidly trying to source large volumes of supply chain components. So from the outset, we saw some challenges around data interoperability. We had a number of different standards in place. So we've got aero, auto, Formula One companies on the assembly and the design and drawing control, model control. And then we were going to supply chains that were largely working in aerospace, automotive. In some cases, specialist components from existing medical device supply chains, and looking to scale those rapidly. And one of the challenges we had was making sure we weren't overloading the supply chains with 2 parallel programs under the Ventilator Challenge UK. In some cases, looking at similar components, similar supply chains, and in some cases we hit clashes where, for electronics components, for example, or key components, we're running up against other ventilator programs in the UK and elsewhere. So managing this rapidly configured consortium, making sure everybody had the right data sets, working to the latest iteration control models, bill of materials, which was evolving as we broke that down and understood what the constituent parts were, where they could be sourced from, whether those were obsolete or could be upgraded. There was engineering of parallel components in some cases. So complex, just bill of materials and design control. But then across the supply chains, from the OEMs down into rapid volume production through supply chain, there was a need to put an overarching control tower in place. So with Accenture, we had a control tower that sat across both programs that enabled us to plug into the ERP systems that Rolls-Royce had put in place to manage supply chain. So we were doing this in parallel, standing up these sort of interoperable systems as we were running. If they'd been available and we had kind of smart factory standards across industry available right from the outset, that would have put us in a hugely powerful position. But we're building this as we went. And it's a key part of being able to rapidly mobilize these complex supply chains, international supply chains in many cases, and really keep tabs on volume flow and revision controls. So there was up-revving of models and drawings as we were producing prototype parts. So the first models were stripped down and deconstructed. We had to build from the new CAD models prototypes from new supply chains that had to be validated, approved, any up-revs to drawings, cascaded out through supply chains, and volume production turned around. And that was electronics, machining, injection molding. We did interestingly look at additive manufacturing as an option for rapid turnaround, but the stock material was not a problem. It was precision machining and finishing often. So more traditional methods were actually more effective. So we had, as well as purchasing ERP systems, supply chain management, we had factory flow planning, digital twins of the assembly factories put in place, and then managing the quality systems through this was all very complex systems being brought together very, very quickly. So the control tower helped us oversee that. Interoperability we maintained was really effective in terms of execution, but as I say, underpinning systems really would help mobilize other similar supply chains rapidly. If you go to the next slide, please. So the interoperability was the value of interoperability was really evident. I think it would have, it became important. It would have helped us reduce, shortcut things even more quickly. But also looking at standards and quality approval. This was not so much about regulatory approval, although we had to check the newly assembled ventilator prototypes from new supply chains met approval. We were really looking at standing up supply chains that were largely aerospace and automotive, working to ISO 9001, AS 9100 standards, to then be operating to the ISO 13485 medical devices standards. So rolling out these quality standards across assembly, 3 or 4 different assembly sites and lines, and a whole sort of cascade of suppliers was a critical thing to deliver really quickly and turned around, within a matter of weeks. Again, really rapid turnaround. And Dick mentioned earlier the regulatory turnaround from what would normally be 200 days to 21 days for the Penlon device. So it's working in partnership with regulatory bodies and standards bodies to be able to understand how can we rapidly condense and compress this development cycle, but still regulatory bodies clearly operating as the gatekeeper appropriately, but in partnership. So we have these pop-up assembly factories working on the COVID-19 restrictions, really quite challenging to model, optimize the layout and flow through those, simulation offline before we started to produce real volume, a rapid supply chain response. And one of the things that was required to roll out the standards, or to have second and first tier operating under the standards that were already approved at Smiths, was using remote training of assembly engineers, supervisors in a training program which was rolled out. So actually, standing up the equipment for the lines was one thing, and improving the site, but also the staff, the trainers and the supervisors on the lines had to be rapidly trained. And that became a bottleneck actually, which wasn't expected right from the outset. And also putting all the test boxes in place, which had to be built, stripped down and designed and built again from scratch from new supply chains and components, and getting the test boxes approved, and operating training and developing expert users to operate test boxes online. So these were all critical path items. And there was a really important role for digital technology in supporting that, bearing in mind the constraints we had, not just in terms of COVID constraints, but also the limited number of experts available in a relatively small-scale normal production environment. So using augmented reality and HoloLens devices, we managed to train remote trainers who then also scaled the training through the assembly sites and put in place the approval checks, workstations, test boxes to really ramp up to deliver at 10 times the normal volume, and delivering units that would have taken years to produce over the space of a couple of months. So standards, quality approval, and use of digital technology to actually roll out and accelerate the roll-up standards was a really important part of that. And Rob Scott will now tell you a little bit about that, particularly talking about the use of augmented reality technology.
Thank you, Sim. Thank you, Dick. Thank you, Ben. I'm Rob Scott. I'm Head of Digital at the University of Sheffield's AMRC, which is one of the 7 high-value manufacturing catapult centres. And I'm going to just take you through one aspect of the ventilator challenge, and that was really the skills challenge, as Sam has mentioned. Next slide, please. So as you've seen before, this infographic really shows the complexity of the whole production cycle of the ventilators, especially the Penlon one. But what we really had to look at was the back office was built on a digital platform, working on the Microsoft, working with Teams, with Dynamics, with Power BI. But that was the back office. We needed to get the support onto the shop floor at the various sites, down at Dagenham Ford, down at GKN in Luton and Cowes, Rolls-Royce, over in Airbus in North Wales, and be able to support it from Penlon in Oxford and from Smith's Medical down in Luton. And the solution that we came to was one of the largest deployments of the Microsoft HoloLens that's happened in the UK to date. Next slide, please. So we used the Microsoft HoloLens, and through begging favors, through borrowing them, from working with companies that we knew already had HoloLenses, we got the ability to deploy. In the end, it was about 50 HoloLens 2s. We'd got 30 HoloLens 1s. And so we'd got the hardware. What we hadn't got was the content to go in that hardware. And so working with a team from Microsoft and also from PTC, the team went into Smiths and into Penlon and used a package called Vuforia Expert Capture to actually capture the experts using the kit and doing the operation. And that is quite often a bottleneck, because so much of the expertise these days is implicit, not explicit. But we had to turn that round. We had to use digital platforms to be able to expose that knowledge so that we could upskill these workers. We were upskilling people that one week were putting together car engines for the Ford Focus, or looking at wing assembly for Airbus planes. And the next week they would be putting together ventilators on whose people's lives depended. So we went into those 2 plants. We looked at this Vuforia Expert Capture, which allowed someone to wear a HoloLens, record what they were doing, and then take that recording offline, and author it by putting in other digital content, other digital assets. We were doing 3D models overnight in the States, and those were getting shipped back. And we couldn't have done this without having a digital platform that we could communicate through. We had to have that transparency and interoperability on that digital platform. So we'd done the capture. We then had to look at the authoring and use that to train thousands of assembly workers on these medical grade ventilators across multiple sites, while at the same time maintaining social distancing. Because this was one of the big challenges. We had so few experts that we couldn't afford to have cross-contamination. We couldn't afford to let different teams intermingle with other teams. So we had to use COVID-19 social distancing rules and the usual practice, or what is now turned into the usual practice. So we really used a platform called Dynamics and 365 Guides to allow the production of holographic work instructions, but also have the ability, which is inbuilt into the HoloLens, to dial in so that a remote expert could actually look through the eyes of the operator remotely and be able to advise and inform them on what the next step was. So we've got general work instructions that we could use and replicate and roll out time and time again, and then you've got the specific interventions. But that rolling out time and time again was actually one of the hardest challenges for the mixed reality challenge within this, because we were going to have to deploy these HoloLenses onto several different sites, looking at several different types of activity, whether you were just putting together a sub-assembly, doing a final test, doing an assembly, and for two different platforms, the Smiths device and the Penlon device. So there was a configuration challenge there, and there was a configuration maintenance challenge. So using Microsoft Intune, we developed a standardized package that was deployed onto every HoloLens. Every HoloLens had a unique ID, so we could do track and trace on those and make sure that they were being kept isolated as necessary, and then ship them out from up here in Sheffield using DHL to get them out to the various sites around the country. The interesting thing for me is that it worked. Because we'd done the upfront configuration using a standardized platform, as soon as they turned up to a specific site, they automatically logged onto that specific site's wireless network. In some cases, we had to create wireless networks so we didn't cross-contaminate with the host company's wireless network. But this is where the IT being integrated into the delivery team was absolutely critical. Some of the other things that came out of this were unexpected. We actually saw the regulators being willing to accept remote sign-off of SQEP accreditation, suitably qualified experienced personnel. So rather than someone having to jump into a car and drive 3 hours and then maintain social distance, we were able to sign off remotely. We were able to provide that remote support while maintaining social distancing, and it was considered a success. So much so that in the days since the ventilator challenge shut down, we've had a number of inquiries from those companies that were engaged with the use of the HoloLens for the ventilator challenge to actually now adopt these and take them on board. So as a proof of concept, it was highly successful. As support for the ventilator challenge, we couldn't have done it without a digital platform. Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. That was a fascinating presentation, and same goes for Sam and Dick. Thanks very much. Right, we've got 10 minutes for some questions now. But just before I get onto the questions, I think there's three main things that I really would like to take home from those three presentations. One is that engineers are obviously naturally very collaborative, so it's not too difficult if you're given the right tools for them to be able to speak across different sectors and across different boundaries and disciplines and things like that. So that's really good. The second is, as Rab just said, digital is the key to agility. It's really important that digital adoption is deployed in that way to achieve that. But overall, I think the third thing that we're all trying to achieve is this word called interoperability. It's not just interoperability with technology, obviously that helps, but people need to be interoperable. They need to be able to collaborate in the way that engineers naturally appear to, but also the companies need to be interoperable. The processes need to be able to line up and to work together to talk to each other in the right way. So I think that's the key takeaway from me from these. I've got loads of questions, but I'll go straight onto them then. One relates to the fact that the ventilator challenge was really good for the people that were inside it. What do you think, Dick, Sam, Rab, we need to do to make sure that everybody can benefit from it? Dick first.
Yeah, so there's no doubt about it. I mean, I think for those who are actually involved directly, you describe it as a life-changing experience, and it's, you know, it is slightly difficult to bottle that up and push it onwards. But we are focusing on those lessons learned and try to sort of promulgate them as much as possible. But the messages are really actually quite simple in amongst all of this. It's about empowering people in the organisation to do the right thing, and it's made us all think, bearing in mind we've got big companies involved here, that in our course of business we do tend to put barriers in the way of people, authority levels, and, you know, layers and layers of things to work through to get something approved. When in actual fact, you know, a lot of people in the business know exactly what's the right thing to do, and yet somehow we disempower them from doing that. And what we did find, because we had to empower people, the rewards are quite profound. And by empowering people, you don't get out of control. In fact, quite the opposite. You put greater accountability with people, and you get a great result. So some really simple messages in that list, and there's a core team that we're involved in it. We are continuing to push the message through things like this. So there are different ways of doing things and think differently. We're also working with government to try and get them to think differently about many of the intervention programs, particularly in the innovation space, which they support.
Sam?
Thanks, Ben. So I think as we're adjusting to this kind of new COVID world, I don't even say post-COVID yet, that we're going to see the markets we're serving as manufacturers changing and evolving rapidly. You know, aerospace and automotive in a rather different shape to a year ago. And I think we're going to see a lot of new product technology coming to market quickly, the need to innovate rapidly to bring new products to market, whether that's for the healthcare sector or towards, you know, green transport, green energy. So that ability to innovate and agility is going to be crucial. And I think there are some things we can try and bottle from this. I've talked a bit about the need for interoperability. So the learning we've had, if those platforms are in place that enable that rapid collaboration, but also looking at how can we work, you know, the learning about working with standards and regulatory authorities to bring new technologies to market rapidly, to massively compress that new product introduction phase. There's a lot of learning there around, well, focus, but also working in partnership towards a common purpose. I think, you know, I believe that can be repeated in other examples of rapid innovation. So I think there's some distilling across a range of bodies, not just those involved, but working with the likes of BSI, but many others. So how can we change the norm on bringing new technology, new products to market rapidly? You know, reducing the time frame by a factor of 10 in this case. So that feels like it's doable. There's stuff we can work on beyond the ventilator challenge to make that easier for the next challenges we're going to face.
Great. And Rab, do you have an answer to that one?
Yeah, I'd very much echo what Dick and Sam had said, but I wouldn't I? But I really think it's about empowering people through communication, but also about openness and transparency. And to some extent, that takes a culture change, but we've proven that it can be done. And that is, I think, one of the most critical things that's come out of this, so that in future, when people are saying we can't do that, you can turn around and say, it's been done. Why can't we do it? It's been done once before. Go on, Dick.
So he said we had no authority to change the culture. This wasn't a company we owned. We just created it, and I told you how pervasive it was. So it's left us thinking, you know, what is it about the way we run our companies that don't allow that culture to exist?
I think that's a great thing to point out. Just a quick one from your perspective, Rab. You mentioned about using remote technologies to audit supplies and things like that. Can you see any other ways of which digital technologies can be used to accelerate regulatory approval?
I can, and this is one of my particular soapbox moments. We've got to engage with the regulators early on in any process. And the easiest way to do that is by sharing through digital platforms. You know, if we had done the ventilator challenge and got to the end and went to the regulatory body and then said, you know, can you approve this? They'd have taken us back to the beginning and asked us to take them through the whole process, because they need to see every step of the process. So why not engage with them really early on, looking at the different stages of the process, and if they don't understand it, then explain it. And again, it's that transparency that is required. And it is the transparency and the willingness to actually expose your failures potentially. What do I mean by exposing your failures? When our children go into nursery school, they learn their pile of bricks will stand up through trial and error. Eventually they get it. As soon as they go into the education system, we introduce a fear of failure. And yet in this digital age, if we can fail fast and fail digitally, but learn from our failures and expose those failures to other people so that they can learn from it, it means that we don't waste time reinventing the wheel. And that goes as much into the regulatory bodies so they understand where the failures potentially could have happened and avoid that, I think.
Yeah, and we're nearly run out of time, and I promised we would finish it on time. But just one question is, if somebody wants to get in touch with you, how should they get in touch with you to discuss this further? Sam.
I was going to let Dick answer that first of all. I mean, I think Ben, you know, we're happy to come to HVM Catapult, basically, to hvmcatapult.org.uk, our website. There's a info option there just to send questions in and make contact with us. You can seek us out on LinkedIn or via BSI. You can access our details. So we're really keen to share. It was a great experience, as Dick's talked us through. You see the energy that it kind of endowed us with. But the real value of this is sharing and changing the way we do engineering and re-engineering of products. So we are keen to work with others and share the experience.
That sounds fantastic. And you said something a minute ago, Sam, about how can we change the norm? How can we really bring into life this culture that just appeared, that Dick described in his presentation? What I'm pleased to say is that BSI has access to a lot of experts. We have access to a lot of information and good practice around things like innovation. We've got ISO 56000. We've got good practice in collaboration in ISO 44000. We've got loads of stuff on interoperability of technology. And we've got things on digital adoption for manufacturers in PAS 1040. So I would encourage everybody to, if they are interested, to get in touch with me directly, and I can send them in the right direction if they want any more information. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up though, because we've got some, we're all busy people, we've got other things to do. So once again, I'd like to thank Dick, Rab and Sam for their presentation. It was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to now go away and think about how we can make our technology people and companies be much more interoperable using digital technology. And hopefully we'll see some action in those areas in the next few months. So once again, thank you very much to everyone who's attended this webinar. I hope you're as fascinated and as interested as I am. But thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.